Hello, everybody. I'm Steve Silverstein, the Associate Chair for Research in the Department of Psychiatry, and welcome to April's Angle Rounds. Today, our presenter is Cero, who will be presenting a talk on social networks and suicide. But before we get to that, I want to just cover the usual housekeeping items. So first, everybody's microphone and camera are off. So you won't be able to communicate with any of the panelists or presenter, at least that way. And then if you have questions, especially to be asked at the end, please put them in the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom right of your screen on the toolbar. And I will ask as many questions as I can when we get to when Ian's done presenting. We tried to keep the chat box for only the panelists here and Steve Fasone and others in case we need to communicate during the presentation. So woe to anyone who uses the chat box inappropriately. Now, it's also important that we get feedback about the presentation, and so there are several ways to do that. Steve Fasone will put a link up at the very end of the presentation that you can click on and complete the evaluation form right then. And there'll also be a link in the chat box. And then tomorrow, a follow-up email will come out that will also have the link to the evaluation. Okay, so now it's my pleasure to introduce Ian, who is one of the first people who agreed to give an Angle Rounds presentation this year. Way back in the summer. Ian is currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Psychiatry, and he's involved with the Center for Study and Prevention of Suicide. He's also a member of our new Quantitative Methods Core. He received his PhD in clinical psychology from Auburn University in 2018, where in addition to the PhD, he also obtained a master's degree in probability and statistics, giving him a very unique background in both clinical and mathematical approaches. So his research integrates those interests, and he's focusing on using abstract quantitative models to basically generate useful clinical insights, of course, especially in the area of suicide. Most often this work involves the complex relationship between a person's social network and their own personal suicide risk, and that's what we'll be hearing about today. Over the last year, Ian has expanded the work he's been doing before to develop a novel social network intervention for adolescents at acute risk for suicide. And that's also the topic of his recently funded KL2 award, which will start this summer. All right, so without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Ian Cero. And again, I'll see you all at the end and ask the questions that you have. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. And hi, everybody out there. Let me just pull up some slides and we can get started. All right, hopefully you all can see that. And if not, find a way to scream loud enough through the internet and I'll see if I can fix it. So today, I wanted to talk about social networks and their influence on the risk for suicide that individual people have them. And at risk of sounding long-winded, I thought one of the best places that we could start would be in Prussia in 1735. The city of Königsberg actually has some unique importance for the history of mathematics, and it's all based in a particular puzzle that the citizens used to play in a cafe. The city itself is based around 4 different islands, and those islands are created by a river that runs through the city. The citizens of Königsberg used to amuse themselves each afternoon by thinking whether there was a way to cross every single bridge that connected all of those different islands only once, but reaching all 4 of the islands. So to give you a sense of what that might look like, and why it's such a complicated puzzle, you would design a route where you might start at the top landmass, move to the center one across bridge 1, then go down to bridge 2. So now you've touched 3 land masses. Then go to bridge 4, then back up to bridge 3, 5, 6. And oh, wait, we're stuck now because we can't get to bridge 7 without crossing any of the other bridges that we've already seen. And so I'll wait for a second and see if anybody's got thoughts. I won't be able to ask you, but I'll pause and maybe you can just try and see if you can solve the puzzle. And if you're like me, you can probably get pretty close, but you almost always, well, I guess always, at least in my case, miss one. There's something about this puzzle that's especially complicated. And in fact, it didn't get solved until 1735 when mathematician Leonhard Euler, who's a giant in mathematics, if you're not someone who's familiar with the history of math, Euler used this problem to found an entire new field in math called graph theory, which is the branch of math that deals with networks, which is why we're talking about it today. And the solution that he came up with involves treating each individual landmass as a node in a network, and thinking of each bridge as a connection between the nodes. So if we're looking at A to B, there are actually 2 connections, bridges 1 and 3. Then there are some more connections over with bridge number 5. Then bridge 4 connects B and C. Then crossing bridge 6, we have a connection between B and D. C also has another connection with bridge 7. And if we separate these nodes and their links, we can think about different statistics that we might want to compute about them. And I think the simplest one to think through here is what we call degree, which is the number of individual connections that one node has to any other node. So in the case of node C, node C has degree 3 because it has 2 connections to node B and it has 1 connection to node D. And this is important. Just a sec. Lost myself here. This is important because if we calculate the degree for each of the individual nodes, we learn something important. Every single one of these nodes has an odd degree, either 3 edges or 5 edges. And if you take a minute to think about it, this is a problem. If you have an even number of edges or links between any given set of nodes, then you can go in and out of that node effectively. So if there are 2, you can go in and out. If there are 4, you can go in, out, touching each of those bridges at any given time. But as soon as you have 3, you can go in, out, and then back in, and you're stuck. Now, this is okay if you only have 2 odd numbered nodes, because you can go in, out, in, and then in, out, in. But if you have any other number of odd degreed nodes other than 0 or 2, this problem is actually impossible. And that was the solution that Leonhard Euler figured out. That based on the statistics of this network, it's actually impossible to visit every landmass, crossing each bridge only once. There will always be at least one bridge that gets crossed multiple times. While this doesn't have a lot of application to suicide, it does have application to transportation networks. If you think about designing a taxi network or a bus network or a train route, you want to be able to hit all of the different places that you want to visit, traversing any individual path only one time. And the message that I was hoping that we could take from this is that networks have mathematical properties that are independent of whether or not we're smart enough to figure them out, that certain networks are good for certain processes and certain networks are not so good for other processes. And that brings us to our focus today. The mathematical properties that different social networks have influence the suicide-related outcomes for their members. This makes those networks important as assessment targets because they tell us who might be at risk for suicide or who might be protected against suicide, but also as intervention targets because our behavior is influenced by the people around us. And once we go through some of that, I'd like to take a look forward to some ongoing projects that we have going on at URMC related to the use of social network interventions for the prevention of suicide in both upstream prevention contexts and also in acute risk contexts. To start, though, I think it's useful to get some context for why social networks matter for humans in the first place. And that starts with the social brain hypothesis. When you look at our brains, we have a greater number of neurons than any other species on the planet. There are some statistics where some other species beat us. For example, I think elephants have larger brain mass. Dolphins have greater cortical surface area. But in terms of raw computational power, no species on the planet has a greater number of individual neurons, the processing units of the brain, than humans. And that begs the question why that's the case. The most obvious hypothesis that most people reach toward first is we evolved to have general intelligence. It's really helpful to be able to do lots of different kinds of things, and big brains make it easy for us to do math, build bridges, and also all sorts of other tasks that we can do much better than other species. The adapted intelligence hypothesis is a little bit more specific and says, no. Human brains were evolved largely for the purpose of solving specific sets of tasks. So there are things that our brains will be really good at, like catching balls that move in parabolic arcs, understanding how slow-moving objects that are around the size that we are move. But things that we're not going to be very good at are things that we never would have had a chance to be exposed to in the era of evolutionary adaptation. Things like climate change are things that don't really make a lot of sense to humans and are therefore hard for us to figure out. Still, an even more specific hypothesis is that actually much of our large brain development has to do with the complex social relationships in which we're involved. And you can think of this just counting the number of relationships that we have to keep track of. If you're dealing with only one other person, there's only one relationship between you that you have to think about. But as soon as you're part of a group of three, you have to think about not only your relationship with each individual person, so we're up to two, but also the relationship between those two people, which can influence things like your access to resources. It gets even more complicated with four, where we have six relationships you have to keep track of. And in a group of just 5 people, a family of 5 people, there are 10 distinct relationships that an individual person might need to keep track of. This grows actually faster than exponential. This problem grows combinatorially. So to the point where if you have 150 people, which would be about the size of a Paleolithic village, there are 11,175 possible relationships that you might have to keep track of. Now, not all of those will exist in any given network, but it's a really complicated problem that humans face. And so it makes sense that in order to be able to navigate those relationships, humans would have had to evolve large brains. We can see this in a famous paper by Robin Dunbar on the development of neocortical size and group size, as well as language in humans. And the best demonstration of this that I've ever seen is Dunbar taking the neocortex ratio, the ratio of how much surface area, computational portions that you have to your brain relative to your brain's overall mass, and then the mean group size that particular species has. So what you're looking at here is a graph of a large number of non-human primate species. And each dot represents, on the x-axis, their neocortex ratio, and then on the y-axis, how big the average group size is for that species. And what you can see is an approximately linear relationship. As neocortex goes up, so too does group size. And we can estimate what that relationship is, and then estimate how big human group sizes probably should be. And when I say should be, I don't mean in like a moral sense, but in the sense of how much computational power do humans have, and how big can a group size get before a human loses track of them, the relationships splinter, and then you need to fracture into different groups. In humans, that ends up being about 150 people, which is a number famously regarded in social network research as Dunbar's number. Based on our brain size, we should be able to maintain relationships with about 150 different people. Not all of these will be intimate relationships, but they'll be people who we know of and people who we would feel comfortable joining at a bar uninvited. And this number ends up being about the size that you see in a band or village of hunter-gatherer societies. So across a wide number of different societies, The mean village size is about 148. Likewise, this number persists across societies and across time as the average size of a company in an army. Sometimes they're a little bit bigger, sometimes they're a little bit smaller. But even with the invention of modern communication technology, the size of the average fighting unit in the military is approximately the same as it was hundreds of years ago, suggesting that this really is kind of an upper limit that constrains the nature of human interaction. I always have to say this because every time we talk about social networks, people say, but what about the internet? If we think that there are general limitations to human social networks that are imposed by the size of our brains, the internet shouldn't change much of that. It might change which people we're able of interacting with, but it won't change the number of relationships that we're capable of keeping track of. And that ends up being borne out in the literature too. Empirically, your internet social network will be about the same as your offline social network. And you can see that here, where we have the frequency of relationships in an online social network, and then in the top panel, and in the bottom panel, you have the frequencies of the number of friends that business employees report having. And they're about the same, with markedly overlapping confidence intervals and a mean centered at around 150. You might respond, but wait a minute, I have 1,000 friends on Facebook, and my response is, well, maybe you don't. What you probably have is about 150 people with whom you interact frequently, whose photos you share, and who you actually genuinely want to spend time with, and then several other people with whom you're listed as a friend. And this ends up being borne out in the literature too, that if we keep track of the metrics of actual interaction with people, it's about 150 in an online and in an offline environment, which is really convenient because it means that much of the time we'll be able to trade results that we find online with results that we find offline, and vice versa. The social brain hypothesis has important implications for mental health too. Knowing that human beings have social networks that follow certain rules that are biologically implied by things like the size of our brains and our genes shows us what our social networks should be doing for us when they're functioning optimally. They're important for things like resource acquisition, for interpersonal emotion regulation, and we'll also see observations like social isolation being intrinsically painful. That's why so much of the work that we do on suicide focuses on things like connectedness. One of the first questions that you ask when you hear someone is at risk for suicide is you ask, what kind of relationships are they in? Are they isolated? Are they conflicted relationships? What's going on socially? We also know that a significant number of suicide attempts happen shortly after an interpersonal conflict. One of the important features of the implications of the social brain hypothesis for mental health is also in social referencing. It's part of how we figure out how to solve problems. If I'm around a bunch of people who act calmly in the presence of a particular problem, then when I encounter that same problem, I offload some of the computational task of figuring out what to do, and I borrow the recent examples that I've got from them for how to act. And that can be good or bad. It helps me calm down when the barista at the coffee shop seems like she's smiling and happy, even though that really doesn't have a whole lot to do with me. She seems calm, and so I seem calm. It's not so good, though, when the person who actually hands my coffee does it shaking, and now I'm anxious because that person's anxious. For people who are at risk for suicide, it might also signal what kinds of solutions make sense for the kinds of problems they're dealing with, which might give rise to things like suicide clusters. I first became interested in suicide clusters and the role that the social network could have for suicide risk, actually not reading about humans, but reading about bacteria. In a paper that is much undercited, some researchers wanted to study the evolution of self-destruct mechanisms in bacteria, or even individual human cells in multicellular organisms that can engage in self-destruction. That's important for things like cancer prevention, if you're a multicellular organism like us, but it's more confusing about why a single-celled organism would engage in self-destruction. In the case of E. coli, there's a particular gene called LIT, L-I-T, that allows some E. coli, if they have it, to self-destruct when they're exposed to a threatening virus. And the thought was that the advantage here is that if one bacterium destroys itself before the virus can spread, then all of the other bacteria are protected. And that ends up being the case, but that doesn't really explain why the gene gets preserved. And I'll show why that happens in a second. So if we drop some altruistic E. coli into a liquid solution, and we also add some control E. coli, some typical non-self-destructive E. coli, and then we add a threatening virus, what you'll see is that the yellow altruistic suicide, or suicide-capable E. coli, will self-destruct when they're infected with the virus. And that has a benefit. It means that the virus can't spread. Likewise, the control E. coli will die, but they'll also spread the virus to other bacteria who also die. So who wins? Which of these different bacteria species is going to win the evolution game in a beaker like this? Well, surprisingly, it turns out to be the non-suicidal E. coli, and the reason is because all of the altruistic E. coli end their lives as soon as they're exposed to the virus, and all of the control E. coli get the benefit. In a liquid solution, there's no way to form a social network. There's no way to have a unique relationship based on space or interaction with any one bacterium over another. They're all just kind of floating around, and so their relationships are random. And if all of the altruistic E. coli and their lives, or even a portion of them, everybody gets the benefit. There's no unique method for the altruistic E. coli to protect one another without also protecting control E. coli. The opposite happens on a dry plate. The E. coli are capable of forming a social network, not in the sense that they're interacting with each other, but in the sense that their spatial relationship to one another allows the sacrifice of one E. coli bacterium to protect the others. What happens is if you introduce a virus to a random point, all of the non-altruistic E. coli will get infected, spread the virus, and die. Only those of the altruistic E. coli that are exposed to the virus will sacrifice themselves. But what they'll do is in the process of sacrifice, they'll create a burn wall that protects all of the bacteria that are beyond them. And as long as there is enough assortativity, which is the clustering of bacteria by type, then the altruistic E. coli will evolve. To make this just a little bit more complicated, though, and then I promise to be done with bacteria, we can study how much clustering is required for the evolution of suicide, at least among bacteria. And it turns out that in a no clustering scenario like the beaker, there's no in-group benefit. There's no way for the altruistic bacteria to help each other uniquely. In a purely clustered environment, the virus loses too quickly. It doesn't really have a good way to spread. Either the non-suicidal bacteria will evolve immunity too quickly, or it'll die after infecting only one individual altruistic bacterium. It's only in cases of moderate social clustering that we see the evolution and preservation of genes related to suicide. In humans, we see similar patterns. We see the clustering of suicide around particular bridges, say in San Francisco, this would be the Golden Gate Bridge, despite the fact that there are a large number of bridges of equal height that are equally fatal, that are all within walking distance. Likewise, we see clustering around particular events in time, like the death of Marilyn Monroe, and then both time and place, like at a particular high school during a particular year. This clustering, the social clustering, is all part of a general phenomenon called assortativity, or assortative mixing. It can happen for a couple different reasons, and the one that people usually worry about, but isn't the only reason, is contagion. That's where my social connections influence my individual attributes. So this would be me knowing someone who's suicidal, and somehow my connection with them influences me to also become suicidal, even though I wasn't before. Homophily is usually the competing hypothesis, which is that individual attributes are the things that cause social connections. Birds of a feather flock together. People like being around other people who are like them, even if those people are also a little bit unhappy. So my individual attributes cause me to seek out people who are like me. And so if I'm at risk for suicide, I might not be looking for other suicidal people, but something about them tells me that I should spend time with them because I have a general preference for people who are similar for me, even if I don't have a preference for people who are suicidal. So in that way, we could see the clustering of suicide because people prefer to be with people who are like them. The most parsimonious hypothesis, but not necessarily the most true, is that shared history from a common environment both causes people to know each other and causes their attributes to be similar. So this might be like two people working at a factory. They know each other because they work at the factory. And when the factory shuts down, they're both laid off, which increases their risk for suicide simultaneously. But it wasn't that their attributes caused them to know each other or that their social connections caused their similarity in terms of suicide risk. There's been a long debate in the literature about which one of these mechanisms makes the most sense. To be honest with you, it's probably the case that all of them matter to some degree, but we want to sort out, which one seems to matter the most. And unfortunately, there's not a great way to do that. We have findings like in a really interesting experiment, students who were randomized to choose their next year's college roommates had greater similarity with those roommates on suicide scores than people who were randomly assigned to different roommates. And that similarity persisted even over the course of the school year, suggesting that people are looking for people who are like them, rather than they were similar when the relationship began, rather than the relationship causing them to become similar. In contrast, work done in our own lab has also shown that school-wide attempt rates are higher in schools when the people who have attempted suicide are more popular. More people are nominating them as friends, suggesting that there's probably some element of social influence where people are looking to who they think are the influential, prestigious members of a social group, and then using those people to kind of figure out what the best way to navigate their own emotional conflicts are. At the same time, we also have research showing that shared risk can cause lots of different changes in the suicide rate, independent of all of these other factors, like the 2008 financial crisis, markedly influencing the overall suicide rate in the United States for several years after. In the end, the problem comes down to the math again. Homophily, contagion, and then shared environment are also confounded in observational social networks. There are many forms of interaction that you could see in an observational network, even if you have longitudinal data, that could make contagion look like homophily and could make homophily look like contagion. And both of them are equally confounded by shared environment. Without running an experiment, there's not really a great way to know. And even the experiments that you can run will put you in the position of being able to study only a small fraction of the phenomena that you're interested in studying. That led me to ask whether it was a waste of time to try and figure out whether or not suicide clusters are caused by influence, homophily, or shared environment, and instead ask whether we could make them clinically useful in some way. It's a phenomenon that we know that is happening in the world. We have good reason to believe that it's bound by things like natural selection, Dunbar's number, social brain hypothesis constraints, and so it should follow a particular quantifiable pattern. If we know that pattern, then we can use it to predict suicide risk. In short, if birds of a feather flock together, we only need to identify a few birds in order to infer the location of the whole flock. The best way to start then was to think about how to quantify assortativity. And fortunately, physicists have done that work for us already in work on crystal development. We can translate that work into a social network like we do here. So imagine that I've got a collection of 6 nodes and I've labeled them with letters. Each of their relationships is labeled with a number so that we can kind of keep them straight. We can put those relationships in a table, like a table on the right. And just to give you a sense of how this table works, look at the relationship between B and A, and you can see that they're over here. Now the nodes are different colors, light gray and dark gray. I've coded dark gray 0 and light gray 1. So the scores for A and B, which are both dark gray nodes, are going to be 0, 0. If you look at link number 2, it expresses a relationship between A and C. Now we have a relationship between a dark node and a light gray node, so it's coded 0, 1. This isn't exactly how we calculate it, but it ends up being mathematically equivalent. If you take the Pearson correlation between these two columns, the column which expresses the similarity across all different links, what you'll get is an assortativity coefficient that ends up being equivalent to a Pearson coefficient, at least in this case. So you can think of assortativity as the correlation across links. Again, there are lots of different ways to calculate it. And if you were dealing with categorical outcomes where you have more than 2, it's a little more complicated. but try to think the correlation across links. So if we were dealing with a network where everyone is different than the people that they're connected to, you would have an assortativity score of -1 for that network. If people are all shuffled up and they interact with each other randomly, you'd have an assortativity score of 0. Likewise, if everybody is the same as everyone else, then you have an assortativity coefficient of 1. To see whether or not human clustering was useful, I collected 2 months worth of Twitter activity. That ended up being, I think, a little bit under a terabyte of texts, and included about 65 million posts from 17 million different people. And about 9 million of those were replies. And that means that people were interacting with each other. So we can create a network among the people on Twitter based on who they're actually interacting with, not just who they're following, not just who they're liking, but who they're actually talking to. And we can use all of and when 2 people are mutually replied, then in this case, I reply to you, you reply back to me, we call them linked. Then we did something a little bit more complicated, which was to take the 10,000 most common words in English, and we had an independent group of raters code all of them multiple times for each word on their suicide relatedness, score of 1 to 9, which is the vertical column over here. This was a set of words that had already been scored from mood, which is your x-axis, with 1 being sad and 8 being happy. This is useful for us because some of the words that are related to suicide will seem like they might just be related to death. For example, the most suicide-related word that we had was death. At the same time, there are also words like killers, ruined, other words that are just sad that we can use to control for whether a word is actually related to suicide, at least with some probability. We use this information to take all of the different posts that we harvested from Twitter to code them for whether they were related to suicide or not. You can see an example of that here. So this is a subset of a Twitter network of about 107 different nodes. The nodes that are dark gray are nodes that talked about suicide. The nodes that are light gray are people who over that 2-month period never said anything that was ostensibly related to suicide. And I think it'd be a reasonable question to ask how sure we are that these people are actually talking about suicide. So we took a random sample of 1,000 posts that were coded yes, talking about suicide, and a random sample of posts that were coded no, gave them to an independent group of raters, and they confirmed that statistically, the groups that were labeled or flagged as being related to suicide represented substantially higher suicide risk on the part of the author, according to a coding scheme that we had, than people who did not. So we followed up and checked. Although this diagnostic process wouldn't be ready for prime time, it does demonstrate a proof of concept that we can think about and with some accuracy detect who's talking about suicide. The final color to pay attention to in this particular slide is the color of the red circles. These are circles where someone who talked about suicide happened to be interacting, at least at one point over that 2-month period, with someone else who was doing the same. This is a way of quantifying suicide clusters. We can use the assortativity coefficient to ask how often people who are talking about suicide are also connected to one another. And in the case of this network and the broader 17 million person Twitter network, it ends up being a correlation of about 0.11. That's pretty small. If you've done anything in social science, it might even be embarrassingly small for people who are used to dealing with correlations of a whopping 0.30. So my question was whether or not we could use that information. Can we use clustering to do something important for suicide prevention? One of the ways that you might think about doing that would be, instead of screening people based on sort of who shows up or screening people at random, if you have limited screening resources and you know that suicide follows an assortative clustering pattern, you can design a screening procedure that takes advantage of that in the social network. Snowball sampling. If you can screen until you find someone who reports being at risk for suicide. Then ask them who their top 5 friends are, screen those people. Among the people who report suicide risk, screen their friends. Among the people who, in that larger group, who report suicide risk, screen their friends, and so on until you run out of screens, which are usually finite and limited. We have, unfortunately, not enough resources to meet the demand. If you were to take that particular network of 107 different nodes, which would be about the size of a small high school class, and you imagine that there are 29 cases that we're worried are about being at risk, and you're only able to screen 20% of them, we could take two strategies. We could screen them at random, at which point we would find an average of about 5 or 6 cases. Or if we employ the snowball screening procedure that I just described, you get substantially more people. In fact, you find more people for the same resources about 68% of the time. You find an average of, I think, 1.22 additional people here, people who are truly at risk. This effect actually even grows the larger the network you have. So if we have only 10% screens available and we were dealing with a total network of about 7,000 people, we would find an additional 100. Suggesting that even though we might not know why clustering happens, we really can do something with that clustering information. We can use it for clinical purposes. At the same time, though, if you want to be realistic about this, we're probably not going to engage in mass screening anytime soon. What matters more is finding what to do with the people that we have. So looking forward on the work that I want to be spending my time on, moving forward, I've spent a lot of time on networks as tools for assessment, and I'm working more now towards networks as tools for intervention, and then even after that, personalized network interventions that are able to adapt to the unique social needs of the people who are in them. And that would be primarily for an acute risk context in adolescents that I'll talk about in a minute. So this work started under the supervision of my mentors, Dr. Peter Wingman and Tony Pisani, who were already working on an intervention that they had designed together called Wingman Connect. And this is a universal prevention intervention for first-term Air Force personnel. It follows 4 distinct cores and teaches people about finding purpose, balance, guidance, and kinship. At least 2 of those are social, and depending on how you think about the others, all 4 of them might be. And the goal is to strengthen social network cohesion among first-term personnel. We also want to be able to use their social networks to diffuse healthy norms for managing career and personal stressors, which are high when you're first enlisting in the military. Recent publication in JAMA shows that this approach has been effective for enhancing social networks and has produced reductions in follow-up depression and in suicide risk. My question was whether or not it achieves that effect by changing the structure of the network itself. We know that popular people are popular. They also tend to be healthier. Is this an intervention that works by redirecting the relationships toward the people who need them? And so the way that we test that is through some fancy math, but easily summarized on the following bar chart. So imagine on your x-axis here, you've got 3 different groups of people. People who rate themselves as having poor coping strategies, median coping strategies, or high coping. And this is a continuous scale, but I've broken it up into tertiles to make it a little bit easier to see. Well, compared to the control group, which was an active control stress management group, median and high coping people in the Wingman Connect group have about as many incoming friendship nominations 1 month after this social network intervention begins. But the poor group, or the poor coping group, does much better in Wingman Connect. There's a significant interaction here, and I think it's a little bit easier to see what it looks like with the network diagram. So I'll show it right here. On the left, and you've got a control class, so this is a real class. Lighter colors mean poorer coping. So the lighter green colors are the people that should pop out to you. And if you look at the class on the left, it's not that the people who have poor coping are completely isolated, but you'll note that they have fewer incoming connections than the better coping nodes, the darker purple nodes. The yellow circles represent people who are also at suicide risk, which is significantly correlated with poor coping skills. So we want people who identify as not really having a lot of coping skills when they first transition into the military to be people who are getting lots of social help. That's not happening in the control group. In contrast, control group, look at the top node, the very top node surrounded by a yellow circle. 4 nominations are heading to this person. These are 4 people who report that they like and want to spend time with this person, even though this person reports no outgoing nodes himself. Likewise, the network is also successfully directing nodes at someone who reports high coping on the left, even though that's not a person that we initially would have thought would have been at risk for suicide, but it's a person who reported to us that they were. So this intervention really seems to be redirecting the social network around a more cohesive framework, sending social resources to the people who need them at a disproportionate rate without doing any damage, taking away connections from the people who were already healthy. To take this intervention and find a way to personalize it would be one of the next steps that we're working on right now. And the way that we thought to do that was taking our training sessions, which are conducted over Zoom, and then ripping the audio from them. If we do that, we can start to study the way that people are interacting with each other in what really is an interactive, sharing-oriented intervention that's designed over the course of a few hours and a few days to shift the nature of a social network. So these are classes of airmen who have recently enlisted. They're now in technical training. We take them class by class, execute this intervention, and then watch their social networks change. We think that some of that change might be related to who's talking to whom and how they're talking to each other in that intervention. The way that we first tried to study that over the summer was by using a voice detection algorithm and just figuring out who's talking and when. Because the algorithm only tells us when a sound wave has features that are characteristic with the human voice, it tells us sort of who's talking, but it doesn't really tell us very much about what they're talking about. Since then, I'm pleased to say that our work has gotten a little bit more sophisticated, and we have a pilot grant from the DoD to be able to incorporate this into our revisions of the intervention, hopefully using that information to study how we could make the intervention even better. And here's a little bit about what that looks like. So a lot going on. This is a 5-minute conversation actually between 3 people in university IT who were kind enough to give us a sample of meeting that they were having. So the people here are labeled A, B, and C to protect their identities. And the connections between them imply the flow of conversation. So in this case, the conversation begins at person 1 or at person B on the right. Connection 1 jumps from B to C because C talks next, and then A talks after that. And then A and C interact for a while, and then C and B interact. And there are a couple things that you can see here. A and B never really interact over the course of this meeting. C is the person who's mediating all connection between them. You can also see that each of these people has a different conversational style. The thickness of the lines represents the duration of all of the comments that they're making, and the color of the lines represents the emotionality. We're able to now get the words that each person is saying to each other and use natural language processing to code what the conversation is like. And so you'll notice that the kinds of things that C says following B are generally very positive. And the kinds of things that A says following C are a little bit more negative. And if you watch this conversation, it's not A being mopey. A is saying things like, I'm not sure that could work. A is being cautious and hesitant, whereas C is being optimistic. We can use this information to refine our intervention, hopefully in real time, to be able to make it personalized to an individual conversation network, maybe spreading out these connections across more people to bring them into the fold. If the conversation's heading in a particular way that we know isn't conducive to later network cohesion, we can alter that in real time, or at least that's the dream. I'll wrap up then with some work that I'm really pleased to have the chance to do. Like Steve mentioned, my KL2 proposal was recently funded, and I'll say some more sincere thank yous in a minute, but I want to open by saying that this really is a broad project that's about more than just me. It's about collaboration that has been going on for over a year now with child and adolescent psychiatry, multiple clinics, including the inpatient and partial hospital. Adolescent suicide attempters are a uniquely acute group. Unfortunately, adolescent suicide rates are up 40% since 2000, making it the second leading cause of death between people from 14 to 25. And among the adolescents who get hospitalized for suicide attempts, 30% of those will reattempt within the first year after discharge. Recent meta-analysis has shown that most of our existing interventions for this group are individually focused. They don't incorporate things like social networks. and are only associated meta-analytically with a 9% reduction in suicide risk, which is pretty low. This is a problem because adolescent suicide attempters are typically discharged to dysfunctional social networks. They have friends with suicidal ideation. They have increased rates of parental psychiatric dysfunction, impaired social problem solving that makes it more difficult to navigate those relationships, and also high rates of emotion dysregulation. So we've been piloting an existing intervention in the adolescent inpatient unit and in the adolescent partial hospital program for the last year. And this was an intervention that we've actually already talked about in grand rounds, pioneered by Cero in the early 2000s. It's called Youth Support Teams. And we've seen, I think, about 10 patients all the way through with some generally positive results. It's an adjunctive social network intervention where an adolescent nominates 3 to 4 people that they already know. Those people become their support team, and they get one psychoeducation session followed by 12 weeks of short check-in calls. And those people are just encouraged to serve as general social supports for the adolescent for the 12-week period. That seems like a light intervention, and mostly because it is, but it has some powerful effects. Dr. King recently followed up on the people in their original randomized trial. And the people who were randomized to have youth support teams showed an overall 50% reduction in all-cause mortality over 10 years. And considering that all it took was nominating 3 or 4 people that they already knew, a little bit of psychoeducation, and a small number of check-ins, this is a significant intervention. The pilot work that we've done, though, comes with some important information. We've also asked people what they would want out of an intervention like this, because as good as youth support teams are, we think they can be even better. So we asked people who would they want to be on their support team. We've tried to figure out, are there enough adults per adolescent? We found that 95% of the people that we interviewed in the partial program, which was about 41 students or 41 patients, reported that they had at least 2 adults outside their families that they thought would be willing to serve in that role. And then we asked them what they wanted help with. And one of the things that was most motivating for me here is that there really isn't a pattern. Some people want help with their family. Some people want help thinking through decisions or avoiding risk. They want behavior regulation. Some people want emotion regulation. And some people just want things like feeling like they're a part of something bigger than themselves. This, to me, said that enhancing the existing youth support team's intervention, focusing it even more on the social aspects, is the way to go. Because instead of trying to target an individual clinical problem, we can build an emotional safety net around these kids that'll be able to solve any of the problems that they deal with. And if we can personalize it, it'll be able to solve the unique problems that each particular kid is dealing with. To that end, we asked people how they would want to communicate with us. And this was during the pandemic, so most people said that they would want to communicate with their team by talking in person, but text messages and phone calls were also okay. We then asked if we could engage in text assessments, so asking them questions about how they're doing, and then text message-based interventions to help them interact better with their teams. And although not everyone was willing to do it every day, we did get pretty strong support for at least one assessment and one intervention a week. And here's about what that might look like. My KL2 is about designing a new intervention, which I've called Youth Connect, which targets the social support network. So in addition to youth support teams, which targets only the adults who then interact with the kid, this will target both adults and kids and their interactions. So again, we'll have 3 to 4 nominated adults, but now we'll have an individual session with the patient too, then an interaction session with the patient and at least one of their support people to try and help them help each other. And to make sure that the intervention stays light and cost effective, we'll also have 12 weeks of text message-based assessment and intervention that'll rely on the same types of technology that we're trying to develop for Wingman Connect. Things where we can tell what a conversation is about, make recommendations based on the kinds of things that have been successful for an individual person. But rather than solving problems for them, we'll help their social network become more cohesive so that it can independently by itself. So over a look back, we've looked at a lot of different types of evidence, but I'd like to take an opportunity to thank some people. This is the grant that will allow me to launch my career. And I would really like to take a second to say that I think that it's a success story. that I'm really excited to be a part of. Without our collaborators in the partial hospital program and in the inpatient unit, this wouldn't be possible. Without the support of my mentors, it also wouldn't be possible. This grant really does represent an example of, I think, the research portions of our department working with the clinical portions of our department to bring a new and successful clinical service, but also new opportunities for research. And I won't delay any longer. I just want to express how grateful I am to have the chance to work here. Thanks.
All right, Ian, thank you. So
Had
thank
those
you.
headphones
That was great, really interesting and very interesting way you integrated a lot of the network theory and the bacteria, and then all the work with people. So that was really, really good.
Thank you.
We have some questions, and the first question is, if some of the networking concepts that you talked about and the results, so far, might be useful when it comes to approaching racism and beliefs that spread or reinforced in social networks. So whether the approach that you described could be potentially useful to possibly reduce some of the racist ideas in networks of people, especially who have extremist ideas.
Yeah, yeah, and to be honest with you, that's an idea that's been around for a little while. Has a ton of evidentiary support, yet for some reason has fallen out of favor in the last couple of years. It just maybe it's not as popular as it used to be. But that reminds me of the contact hypothesis, which is research that I think originally started in the 60s and 70s, but has a very strong evidence base that persists even today, that shows that one of the most powerful methods that we have for overcoming extremism, bigotry, and prejudice is just putting people who are different from one another next to each other in a context where they have a mutual project to work on, and in a context where they're on equal footing. So this would be things like picking up litter, maybe two colleagues working on the same project who wouldn't normally, or people painting a mural on a wall. The research shows, based on the fact that we're all just the kinds of organisms that tend to want to affiliate and elaborate our networks, that social instinct is stronger than our bigotry and prejudice. And so if you wanted to make an intervention that would use social networks to overcome things like bigotry, prejudice, and racism, the way to do it is actually straightforward. It's just find people and give them excuses to spend time with one another. That's the best data that we've got.
Okay, thanks. The next question is, have you noticed at all in your work that if people have significantly more than the average 150 connections, let's say, that those people are different somehow? For example, might they have increased suicide rate or poorer quality of relationship? Anything else?
Sure. I don't know of any research linking linking your atypical socialness to suicide risk. I don't know the answer to that question. My suspicion would be probably not. My guess is the kind of people who have the capacity to maintain something like 800 relationships are probably in unique social positions. So that might be someone like a CEO or a politician who just kind of has to keep track of that many relationships. But I don't have a reason to think that on its own would be associated with suicide risk. Usually we see the opposite, that people with fewer connections are at greater risk.
Interesting. Okay. Now, another question, this has to do with, I guess, just the similarity maybe across systems or levels of analysis.
Sure.
I guess it seems to, that isolation is bad at many levels in
The worst
of life. If you isolate neural networks, either through a lesion, for example, or some kind of trauma, you're likely to get hyperexcitability and burst firing, et cetera. And certainly in depressed people and people with psychosis, it seems like one of the things you're trying to do in treatment is to integrate, create a greater network to challenge essentially or weaken some of the fixed negative ideas in depression or psychotic delusional ideas with psychotic disorders.
Sure.
So I'm just wondering if you thought of applying this not only to other social problems, but to either how psychotherapists can work in terms of analyzing language in the session, or how people who do brain stimulation might approach their work.
Sure. I guess I think about it, yes, is the answer to your question, but I think I think about it a little bit differently. So rather than trying to eliminate or undo pathology, I think that the reason the absence of connections is associated with pathology is because we really are a species that's designed to function as part of a social unit. So helping give people the kinds of social resources that their brains need to be able to solve problems, bouncing ideas off of somebody else, helping someone else soothe the emotions that I'm trying to regulate. I think my intuition is that there's the real advantage of the social network. If we were going to try to use that research to figure out how people could make their existing connections even better, I think the way to do that would be to, like you implied, to study a given process with a lot of attention. I think natural language processing is a great tool that can help us do that, to sort of figure out what are the kinds of things that therapists tend to say that tend to make people get better. It doesn't seem like it because it's such an emotional issue, but it's a mathematical problem.
Yeah, in a way, you could think of CBT as increasing the richness of the ideational network. So it's not always just negative thinking, et cetera.
Right.
Okay, so we are just about out of time. We always stop a couple minutes early because our interpreters have to get to their next job. So first, Ian, thank you again. This was really interesting. And, we look forward to having future presentations from you and seeing where this work goes.
Thanks for having me.
All right. All right, everybody. See you next month. Bye.